So we've been talking up to this point about the three major domains of organisms. So remember, a domain is the thing when you're talking about the different taxonomic groups, the largest taxonomic group, you got domain, then kingdom, then phylum, all the way down to genus and species. And we talked about the bacteria, the archaea that form the prokaryotes, and then the eukaryotes. And this is just another way to depict that. These are the three major domains. We've kind of looked at eukarya in a little bit more detail. But I want to talk today about what makes these things organisms. So we talk about an organism. What is an organism? What defines something as a living organism? So just a sort of concept map of where we're going. Organisms are life forms, and they're considered alive because they can do these five things. Number one, they can acquire and use energy. Number two, they're made up of one or more cells. Number three, they can process information. Number four, they're capable of replication. And number five, they're a product of evolution. So we've already talked about these two aspects of living organisms in some decent detail. So we've talked about evolution, natural selection, all the different other processes that can result in evolution, and that organisms are a product of these processes. And we've talked about uni and multicellular organisms and colonial organisms, and the fact that, prokaryotes are unicellular, and that eukaryotic organisms are also composed of cells, and they can be unicellular or multicellular. So we sort of covered these topics to an extent. So I want to work into these other three topics, and that's what we're going to be working on for the next couple of weeks. These ideas, basically, that organisms use energy, process information, and are capable of replication. So we're going to talk about how they do that, how they do those three things. So themes for the next couple of weeks, we'll be talking about how do organisms respond to their environment, how do different taxa maintain something called homeostasis, how do different groups of organisms reproduce, and how do different groups of organisms acquire and process nutrients. So we'll be covering this, like I said, for the next few weeks. And what we're going to talk about this week specifically is how do organisms go about responding to their environment or respond to stimuli. So once again, we're looking at sort of on this concept map, this idea of how organisms process and respond to information from their environment. So when we're talking about information from the environment, information is initially received as a stimulus or signal. So these are the sort of terminology that we'll use when we're talking about something from the environment that an organism responds to. It can be called a stimulus or a signal. And so I want you to spend just, 1 minute, 30 seconds maybe, brainstorming different types of signals an organism might receive from the environment, remembering that the environment can be both biotic, so living, and also abiotic, so non-living. So an example of a particular stimulus or signal might be heat. So there's a hot pan and your body responds to that heat. So the stimulus or signal is heat. So go ahead in the chat, just type in your example of a stimulus or signal that an organism might respond to. A lot of people have been putting in fear and pain. And I want to make it clear that, fear and pain are certainly responses that animals will have. But the fear itself, you can't show something to an organism and say, this is fear, and you're going to respond to that fear. Fear is a response that an organism has, right? So you might see a scary monster, but you have a visual signal then. So you're getting light waves to your eyes, and that's causing this response that's fear. Or for example, you could have this frying pan that's got a lot of heat in it, and you're feeling pain in response to that heat, but that pain response is a response in the organism. It's not the actual stimulus itself. The stimulus in that case is heat. Okay, so it's important to make the distinction between a stimulus or signal like heat and then the actual response, which is fear or pain or whatever it is. And so I've put up a list of a lot of the ones that I can think of, and I'm sure there's others, but examples of stimuli or signals can be temperature, pressure, a magnetic field, light, gravity, so pH or acidity, moisture, types of habitats you have, altitude or pressure, sound, radiation. You can respond to a pathogen. You can respond to nutrients. You can respond to herbivores or predators that are present in the area, but likely you're getting different signals from those. So you might see them, and so you're getting, once again, a photo response, or you might smell them, so you're getting a chemical pheromone or odor from them. Wind is another example, and this is probably goes back to you're feeling changes in pressure, or you might be feeling changes in temperature. And so all of these things are examples of signals that an organism might respond to. And so in response to that, so you get this signal and you'll have a response, and there's different kinds of responses that organisms can have. And one of those sort of general types of responses are something called constitutive responses. I've heard it called constitutive or constitutive. But constitutive responses are traits that are always present and are typically an adaptive response to a consistent selective pressure, okay? So these are responses from many, many generations of natural selection where an organism gets an adaptation in response to a selective pressure, and that trait or that adaptation doesn't change within an individual's lifetime. So an example of this might be spines on a plant, okay? So over many, many years and many, many generations, spiny plants have evolved these spines to resist herbivory. So we often see these in dry places where animals, different organisms are trying to eat that plant to get into the moisture and liquid that are in there. And so these plants have evolved spines to stop those organisms from getting in there. But those spines are always present on the plant. They never go away. It's not like these spines see a predator coming, or these plants see a predator coming and they magically grow these spines. It's just they always have those spines, and they've been selected for over many, many generations. And so this is an example of a constitutive response or a constitutive response. It's a response that an organism doesn't change within an individual's lifetime. It's always there. And this is in contrast to something called an inducible response. So an inducible response is a short-term or reversible response that's activated by environmental stimuli. So an organism is basically responding to a stimulus in real time. And this response can change within an individual's lifetime. So an example of this might be changes in plant growth and production of plant hormones in response to light or dark conditions. So you can see this is a plant grown in dark, and this is a plant grown in light. And so if you have a lot of light that this plant is responding to, it doesn't grow as tall and as long because it doesn't need to reach the light. But if you grow this same plant in the dark, it can grow really, really long and have a long distance between these individual sort of nodes. And that's because it's trying to reach the light. And so it's getting less light, and as a response, it's producing different hormones, and that's causing it to grow in a different way. But if you took the same plant and you put it into a light condition, all of a sudden those nodes would stop growing so long, and it would start growing, the plant would start growing like this. And so that response can change within an individual's lifetime. It's a short-term or reversible response. So an induced response versus a permanent response, like spines. Okay, so let's try a poll question. And C is in fact the correct answer. So a pufferfish inflating in response to the presence of a predator. This is inducible. So basically they receive a light signal, they see the organism, and then they puff up in response to the presence of that predator. Whereas all the rest of these are examples of constitutive or permanent responses. They're permanent traits that have evolved over many, many generations. All right, it seems like you guys get this stuff. So the other part of a response or an induced response that I want to talk about is sort of the general components that make up one of these induced responses. So like when a pufferfish blows up, how does that work? And there's basically 5 general components to any induced response, where you have a stimulus or signal, you have a sensor and a signal transducer that translates that signal into something that the organism can sort of understand. You have a signal transmission system that sends that signal around throughout the body of the organism. Then you have something called a response, and then you have something called an effector. Okay, so just to sort of put this in context, you can think of this like a thermostat and a heating system in your house. So in this case, it's a cold day, so the stimulus is the temperature or the cold. Then you have a sensor or a signal transducer, in this case, the thermostat that detects the temperature, and then a signal transmission system, which is essentially the electrical line that's hooking up this thermostat that takes the temperature and translates it into an electric signal. So it's signal transducing. That means translating it into electrical signal. It passes that signal through the transmission system, so this electric line, to what's called the effector. So in this case, the heater is the effector, so it's going to affect change in that sort of response. This is the thing that's responding. So in this case, it produces heat. So this is the response, is the production of heat. And then that has a feedback to the thermostat so that this sort of can loop back and respond. Okay, so you can think about this. It works the same way in humans. Instead of having a thermostat and a heater, though, we have our hypothalamus that detects cold temperatures when our body temperature gets too cold. In response to that, it'll send a transmission. So it detects the cold. It'll send a transmission system, which is our central nervous system. So it'll translate the temperature signal into an electric signal that travels through our nervous system. In response, our muscles will shiver. So this is the effector, and that'll create heat to sort of heat the body back up and let the hypothalamus know that we're doing okay. So we have similar things actually in plants. Plants also have receptors and signal transduction. An example of this would be these things called statoliths. So there's lots of different examples of this in plants. This is just one example in plants, these things called statoliths that can detect gravity. So they're basically just these little sort of stones that are in each plant cell that respond to gravity and sink to the bottom of the cell. And then they release this hormone that's called auxin. And when they sort of gather up in this one area, there's a lot more auxin on this side, so the plant can detect which way is down and then grow down. And this is often what we see in root tips. So the plants know to grow the roots down and which way down is in response to gravity. So in this case, we have a stimulus or a signal. In this case, it's gravity. We have a sensor or transducer. So this is the statoliths that translate gravity into another signal that the plant can interpret. And that that transmission system, or it's translated into hormones. In this case, auxin is the hormone, but plants, they don't have a central nervous system, okay? So they can't turn things into electric signals and spread it out through their body of the plant. Only animals have that central nervous system. And so instead of using a central nervous system, they use hormones. And there's lots of different hormones. I wouldn't expect you guys to memorize all of these hormones, but I want you to understand that the major transmission system that plants use are hormones. And those shifts in hormones alter growth. And so in this case, the effector of the response is the root growth. And we see a similar thing in animals. Okay, so if we look a little bit more closely in animals, let's say you smell a cup of coffee in the morning, and you have these olfactory nerves. And in those olfactory nerves, they have these protein receptors that are embedded in the cells that make up those sort of olfactory nerves. Okay, and so this protein receptor will bond to a chemical for the environment. So you can think of this chemical represent the coffee smell. It'll bond to that, and that will be translated by this protein receptor, or this chemoreceptor is what it's called, into an electrical signal, basically by changing ion balances. And so that electric signal will once again be spread through the central nervous system, and then it'll have some sort of response. So in this case, the stimulus or signal is some chemical, in this case, the smell of coffee or little coffee molecules. You have a sensor or transducer. In this case, it's a chemoreceptor. And then you have the transmission system. So the chemoreceptor turns that chemical signal into an electric signal that spreads through the central nervous system. And then you have an effector or response. So in this case, you might salivate in response to the smell of coffee in the morning. And in fact, animals have a whole bunch of different types of receptors. So you can have chemoreceptors that detect chemicals. You can have mechanoreceptors that detect pressure. You can have photoreceptors that detect light. And many of these receptors are not unique to animals, but plants also have many of these receptors as well. Okay, but the whole idea here is these receptors can pick up different types of stimuli and translate them into stimuli that the organism can interpret. So you yourself, you're not really good. Your body, your central body is not really great. Your central nervous system is not good at picking up heat. But different things, these receptors can pick up heat and then translate that into an electronic signal that can be transmitted throughout your body for you to respond to it.